Let me tell you something about blood. Most people think it is dramatic. It is not dramatic. It is a cleaning problem. A very specific, very time-sensitive cleaning problem with a pH of approximately 7.4 and a serious grudge against grout. My name is not important. What is important is that I have cleaned 114 crime scenes in 4 years. I am very good at my job. Scene 115 was the one that ruined everything. Here is how this works. Someone calls a number, not my number, a service number. The service takes the job, takes a cut, passes it to me. I show up with a kit that weighs 42 pounds. I clean, I leave, I get paid. I do not ask what happened. I do not ask who did it. I do not ask why there is a perfectly good plate of pasta still on the table next to what I am being paid to remove. This is not callousness. This is professionalism. I have cleaned offices, warehouses, apartments, one extremely memorable boat, and a storage unit that I still think about sometimes when I'm trying to sleep. I have opinions about carpet. Specifically, I have opinions about why anyone installs light beige carpet in a business that handles cash. I have a playlist called Work Stuff on Spotify that contains 47 songs and which I will take to my grave without ever showing another human being. I show up. I clean. I leave. 114 times without incident. Scene 115 was a Tuesday. The job came in at 10:47 p.m. Back office of a restaurant called Marinello's on the east side. I know Marinello's. Not because I have eaten there. I do not eat at restaurants that have called the service. I parked 2 streets away because parking outside a scene is what amateurs do. I have a cover story, a cleaning company logo on my jacket, and a van that says Pro Fresh Solutions on the side. The logo cost me $40. I have never once been questioned about it. I let myself in through the service entrance. I opened the door. I turned on my head torch. I assessed the scene. And then I heard something that in 114 jobs I had never heard before. A cough. Not a dramatic cough. Not a movie cough. The specific wet, interrupted cough of someone who has been lying on a floor for several hours and whose body is attempting to remind them that it still has opinions. I stood very still for approximately 4 seconds. I turned my head torch to the left. Behind the desk, on the floor, was a man. Late 50s, gray suit, a tie with small ducks on it. Not a criminal tie. This man had not chosen that tie for criminal activities. He opened his eyes. He looked at me. He said, "Am I dead?" I said, "Not yet." He seemed to find this only partially reassuring. Here is the thing about my job. It has a very clear scope. I clean scenes. I do not render medical assistance. I do not call emergency services because emergency services ask questions, and questions lead to explanations, and explanations lead to the kind of conversations that end careers. Mine, specifically. But the man on the floor was alive, which meant he was not a scene. He was a witness who had just seen my face. I looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at me. Gerald said, "Is there a phone?" I said, "Why is your tie covered in ducks?" Gerald said, "It was a gift from my daughter." And that, right there, was the moment I knew I was not going to be finishing this job. My phone buzzed. Text from the service number. It said, "Job confirm. Client needs verification." I typed back, "Slight complication." The response came in 11 seconds. It said, "There are no complications. Confirm the job." I put my phone in my pocket. I said, "Can you walk?" Gerald said, "I don't think so." I said, "Brilliant." I did not become a crime scene cleaner because I lack empathy. I became a crime scene cleaner because I have significant empathy and a very practical relationship with mortality, and also because the money is genuinely excellent. But dragging a 50-something accountant named Gerald across a restaurant kitchen at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday while wearing a ProFresh Solutions jacket, this was not what I budgeted for emotionally. Gerald was heavier than he looked. Gerald also had opinions. He had opinions about the pace at which I was moving him. He had opinions about the grip I was using. He said, "What van?" I said, "The ProFresh Solutions van." He said, "What is ProFresh Solutions?" I said, "A cleaning company." He said, "Why is a cleaning company here at 11 p.m.?" I said, "Gerald, I need you to focus on moving your feet." Gerald moved his feet. I got Gerald into the van at 11:23 p.m. This took 11 minutes. 11 minutes during which I developed opinions about Gerald that I did not previously have. He said, "You are not a cleaner." I said, "I am absolutely a cleaner." He said, "Cleaners do not carry that many enzyme solutions." I said, "Different specialty." Gerald said, "What specialty?" I said, "Crime scenes." There was a silence. Gerald said, "Oh." I said, "Yes." Gerald said, "So they called someone to clean up after me?" I said, "Yes." Gerald said, "And I was not supposed to be alive?" I said, "Correct." Gerald said, "And now you have a problem." I said, "Gerald, you have no idea." It turned out Gerald knew quite a lot. Gerald had been doing accounting work for a property development company. 6 months ago, he had noticed transactions that did not correspond to any property development activity. Gerald had started asking questions. Gerald had written a report. Gerald had emailed the report to his senior partner. His senior partner had forwarded that email to the wrong people. Those wrong people had arranged a dinner meeting at Marinello's. Gerald had gone because he thought it was a professional meeting. He had not made it past the appetizers. I said, "Gerald, you have to stop talking to me." Gerald said, "Why?" I said, "Because the more I know, the more complicated this gets." Gerald said, "You were going to clean up after me." I said, "I was going to do my job." Gerald said, "Your job was to make me disappear." I said, "My job was to clean a scene." Gerald said, "Thank you." I said, "Do not thank me. I am very annoyed about this." My phone rang at 11:51 p.m., a number I did not recognize. I answered. A voice said, "The job is not finished." I said, "The job has a complication." The voice said, "There are no complications. You know the terms." I looked at Gerald. He was looking at me. I said, "I do not do that." The voice said, "Then you have a problem." I said, "Then I have a problem." I hung up. Gerald said, "That sounded bad." I said, "Gerald, I need you to tell me everything you know about the property development company." Gerald started talking. Gerald talked for 19 minutes without stopping. I dropped Gerald at the emergency entrance of St. Catherine's at 12:34 a.m. Gerald did not want to get out. He said, "What happens to you now?" I said, "That is not your problem." He said, "They know what you look like." I said, "Gerald, I need you to go inside now." Gerald said, "I am a very good accountant. You might need one." I said, "I will keep that in mind." I watched Gerald through the glass. I sat in the van for 4 minutes. Then I opened my contacts. A name I had not called in 6 years. My sister. Detective Sarah Chen. Homicide. She answered on the second ring. I said, "I found something alive." She said, "Explain." I said, "I will. But I need you to know first that I've been doing something that is going to require an uncomfortable conversation." She said, "You have been cleaning crime scenes for cash." I said, "How long have you known?" She said, 4 years. I was waiting for you to tell me. I said, I found something alive, Sarah. She said, where are you? I said, outside St. Catherine's. She said, do not move. I looked at Gerald through the window. His duck tie was visible even through the glass. 114 jobs. 115. I was going to need a completely different kind of clean. Gerald survived. The property development company did not. The senior partner was arrested 11 weeks later. And me, I found a different kind of cleaning work. Environmental remediation. Significantly less complicated. Though the enzyme spray is basically the same.